Some men build things with their hands their whole lives. Houses, barns, fences, futures. And some men build nothing but the appearance of having built something, propping up a facade with borrowed money and borrowed time, waiting for someone else to notice the cracks before they do. I'm Frank Deller. I'm 68 years old, a retired electrician from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And for 14 years I watched a man named Stuart Pruitt look at my son, the way a landlord looks at a tenant who's 3 months late on rent with patience. Yes, but the cold kind. The kind that's really just waiting. I never said a word. Not until the morning my son called me to say I wasn't welcome at my granddaughter's wedding. It was a Sunday, in early April. The dogwoods along my street on Caldwell Drive were doing what they do every spring, just exploding white and pink like they have no memory of winter at all. I was out on my back porch with a cup of coffee and the crossword I never finish, listening to the birds work through their morning business, when my phone rang. It was my son, Daniel. I picked up on the second ring, the way I always do. He didn't open with hello. He opened with Dad, and there was a specific weight on that single syllable that told me whatever came next was going to cost us both something. He said Melissa and her parents thought it would be easier, smoother, less complicated if the rehearsal dinner stayed to her side of the family. That I'd understand. That it was nothing personal. That the wedding ceremony itself, of course, I was still invited to that. I sat with that for a moment. 14 years of Sunday dinners where Stuart Pruitt talked about his commercial real estate portfolio like it was a civic institution. 14 years of Melissa's mother Patricia asking Daniel, with a smile like a paper cut, whether he'd looked into getting his contractor's license. 14 years of me quietly writing checks that kept that family's life looking the way Stuart Pruitt needed it to look. And now, I wasn't welcome at the rehearsal dinner. I told Daniel I understood. I said, "Take care of yourself, son." Then I set the phone on the porch railing, picked up my crossword, and stared at 4 across without reading a single letter. I want you to understand something before we go any further, friends. I'm not a man who yells. Never have been. Edna, my late wife, used to say the thing that scared her most about me wasn't when I raised my voice, because I almost never did. It was when I got very, very quiet. She said that's when she knew I was actually thinking. And she was right. Because what followed that phone call wasn't anger. It was arithmetic. Let me take you back to where the numbers started. 14 years ago, Daniel was 26 and working as a project manager for a mid-size residential construction firm here in Rutherford County. Good, steady work. He'd been dating Melissa Pruitt for about a year, and I liked Melissa. I still like Melissa, to be clear. She's warm and funny, and she loves my granddaughter Sophie in a way that is completely genuine. What I didn't fully understand at the time was that Melissa came with a father who had decided, quietly and permanently, that Daniel Deller was a placeholder, a man good enough for now, insufficient for always. Stuart Pruitt presented himself as a commercial real estate developer. Big handshakes, firm eye contact, the kind of man who says, "We should do lunch," and then never follows up, because the invitation was never really an invitation. He had a 6-bedroom house in Brentwood, with a circular driveway, and one of those outdoor kitchens you see in magazines. He wore monogrammed cuffs to backyard barbecues. He told Daniel, at the very first family dinner I attended, that his own father had been a self-made man, and that he admired people who came up the hard way. He said it the way you'd compliment someone's modest used car, kindly, generously, from a great height. His wife Patricia specialized in a different technique. She never said anything outright critical of Daniel. She would just ask questions, thoughtful, interested-sounding questions like, "Is the construction industry pretty stable these days?" Or, "Do you think you'll stay in Murfreesboro long-term?" Questions engineered to make Daniel feel like a guest in his own life, always being evaluated for a permanent position he'd never quite earn. I sat across from these people twice a month for 14 years. I passed the breadbasket. I asked about their home renovation projects. I listened to Stuart explain, for what must have been the 40th time, why the Nashville commercial market was undervalued and how he'd positioned himself to benefit from it. I said things like, "That's interesting, and sounds like you've done your homework, Stuart." And I drove home on I-24 with the windows down and talked to Edna in the passenger seat the way I did after she passed, telling her, I swear, sweetheart, that man has never laid a hand on anything he built. He just finances what other men build and calls it development. But here's what nobody at those dinners knew. Here's the part I need you to understand before you judge any decision I made after that phone call. 3 years after Daniel and Melissa married, they had Sophie. 3 years after Sophie was born, Melissa's health had a rough patch, nothing catastrophic, but 18 months of specialist visits and adjustments and the kind of medical uncertainty that drains a bank account as quietly and completely as a slow leak drains a tank. During that stretch, Daniel called me one evening, voice stripped down to the studs, and told me he didn't know how they were going to manage the mortgage and the medical bills both. He wasn't asking. Daniel has never asked me for a single dollar directly in his life. It's one of the things about him I admire most, and find most heartbreaking in equal measure. I told him to let me handle the mortgage while they handled Melissa. He started to object. I said, Daniel, this is not a discussion. What followed over the next 4 years was $71,000. I want to say that plainly and without drama, friends, because it matters later. $71,000. Mortgage payments during Melissa's treatment period. A new HVAC system when theirs gave out in August. Sophie's preschool tuition for 2 years, because the good one, the one on Fortress Boulevard with the experienced teachers and the outdoor curriculum, I was $900 a month, and I'd rather go without a vacation than have my granddaughter in a lesser school. A used Subaru when Melissa's car died on the interstate. I supervised the installation of a new roof personally, called in a favor from a man I'd worked alongside for 20 years to make sure it was done right. I told Daniel each time that it was nothing, that I had it, that he'd do the same for me. He'd say, "Thank you, Dad," with that particular quiet that sounded like a man trying to hold something fragile without visibly straining. I understood. I'd been that age once, trying to build a life, and feeling the gap between what you had and what you thought a man was supposed to have at your age. I never told Stuart Pruitt any of this. Not because I was keeping score, because it was none of his business. The final amount? A $12,000 check I had prepared for Sophie's college savings fund. An account I'd been slowly building in her name since she was born, was sitting in an envelope in my kitchen drawer. The morning Daniel called me about the rehearsal dinner. I had planned to present it formally at the rehearsal dinner itself, a grandfather's gift to his granddaughter on the occasion of her parents' next great chapter. After I hung up with Daniel, I went inside, opened the kitchen drawer, and looked at that envelope for a long time. Then I called my financial advisor, a straight-talking woman named Carol Briggs, who has managed my retirement accounts for 15 years and who I trust completely. "Carol," I said, "I need to redirect a fund transfer I've scheduled for this week." She said, "Of course, George." She always called me George by mistake. I never corrected her. "What do you need?" I said, "Hold everything. Don't release a single dollar until you hear from me again." Brief pause. "Everything all right, Frank?" "Not entirely," I said, "but it will be." I hung up, walked out to the back porch, and sat with the dogwoods and the birds and the cold arithmetic until the coffee went cold. The phone call that told me exactly who Melissa's parents were came at 8:40 the next morning. It wasn't Melissa. It was Patricia. She didn't say good morning. She said, "Frank, Melissa tells me you had some kind of reaction to the rehearsal dinner arrangement." The word arrangement, like what had happened, was a seating chart problem and not a demolition. Her voice had that particular practiced calm that women like Patricia deploy when they want to sound above conflict while being directly inside it. I said, "Patricia, I don't think I had a reaction. I think I had a response. There's a difference." Silence. I said I'd been planning to present a gift at the rehearsal dinner, a college savings deposit for Sophie. Since I won't be attending, I've put the transfer on hold. Another silence. A longer one. The kind where you can practically hear a person adding up numbers they should have been adding up a long time ago. She said she was sure we could work something out. I said I'm sure we can too. Then I thanked her for calling and said goodbye before she had a chance to say anything further. I want to tell you, friends, and I mean you, Whether you're watching from a kitchen table, or a porch chair, or a waiting room somewhere, that was the first time in 14 years I ended a call with a Pruitt before they were finished talking. It felt the way I imagine a man feels when he finally sets down something heavy he's been carrying so long he forgot he was carrying it. Daniel arrived at my house on Caldwell Drive 48 hours later. I heard his truck in the driveway around 10 in the morning, Saturday. He knocked twice, hard, the knock of a man who rehearsed what he was going to say on the 40-minute drive from his house. I opened the door. He was in a work jacket and jeans, jaw set, eyes doing that thing they do when he's working very hard not to show something. He looked like his mother. He always has. More every year. Dad. He exhaled it the same way he had on the phone, like the word itself was an effort. Sophie's college fund. Patricia told Melissa, "You froze it. What is going on?" I stepped back. "Come inside, Daniel." "I don't need to come inside. I need to know." "Daniel, come inside." He came inside. I poured him coffee, the way his mother always made it, and set it in front of him at the kitchen table, sat across from him. Looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw what I always see, a decent man who has spent 14 years measuring himself against a standard built specifically to be unreachable. I said, "You called me Sunday morning." He shifted. "Dad, the rehearsal dinner." Melissa's parents just thought. "You called me Sunday morning," I said again. Same volume, same speed. "And you told me I wasn't welcome." Long pause. "Yes," he said, quietly. "Yes, I did." "Okay," I nodded. "Then you understand why I made the call I made." "No," he said, and his voice cracked slightly at the edges. "No, I don't understand, because that's Sophie's money, Dad. That's not about me and you and the Pruitts. That's Sophie's future." I leaned forward slightly. I said, "If I'm not family enough to be at the dinner table, Daniel, then I need to think carefully about how I'm directing my resources. That's not punishment. That's just clarity. I've spent 14 years being financially present and socially invisible in your life. I'm 68 years old. I'm done doing both." He stared at me. "Good. Let it land." I said, "I've given this family $71,000 over the past decade. Not because you asked. Because I watched you work yourself to the bone, and I watched your father-in-law look at you like a problem to be managed, and I decided the one thing I could do was make sure you never had to go to that man with your hand out. That was the line I drew with myself. He crossed it the day you called to uninvite me from that dinner." Daniel's jaw worked. He looked down at the coffee cup. He didn't say anything for what felt like a long time. "I didn't know it was that much, Dad." "I know you didn't. Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because it wasn't about the money. It was about you not having to feel small in front of Stuart Pruitt. I wasn't about to take that away from you by making it a transaction." He left 40 minutes later, truck still warm. I watched him back down the driveway, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Solid. Like a wall with a good foundation. Now, here's where the ground shifts, friends, and I need you to stay with me, because this is the part where everything underneath the Pruitt family's life started showing what it was actually made of. Daniel went home and told Melissa everything. Melissa, to her credit, did not call her mother immediately. She sat with it, she thought. Then, she did something I didn't expect. She called me herself that evening and asked if she could come over and look at the numbers. She sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and went through every transfer I'd documented, and I had documented all of it, because I was an electrician for 35 years, and I have never in my life run a wire without checking the load. She looked at every mortgage payment, every medical bill period, every receipt. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, and she pressed her lips together for a moment before she spoke. "Frank," she said, "does my father know any of this?" "No," I said. "It wasn't his business." She nodded slowly, was quiet. Then she said, "He told Daniel last year that he'd been setting aside money for Sophie's education, matching whatever we saved." She paused. "We saved $11,000. "And did he match it?" I asked. She looked down at the legal pad. "We haven't been able to reach him about it since January." There it was. Over the next 2 weeks, following that thread, Daniel pulled it. He was careful, methodical contractor's instincts, even if he'd moved into project management. He found the public filing records for Pruitt Development Group first. 2 active liens on commercial properties in Davidson County. A judgment entered last fall from a subcontractor who hadn't been paid for 8 months of work. He found the Brentwood house had been refinanced in 2021 and again in 2023. The equity was gone. He found that the outdoor kitchen Daniel and Melissa had admired for years was still under a financing agreement with a company that had tried to collect on it twice. He called a friend who worked at the country club Stuart Pruitt mentioned at every single dinner party. His friend went quiet for a moment and then said, very carefully, "Stuart's account has been inactive for about 10 months, Dan." Stuart Pruitt wasn't a developer. Stuart Pruitt was a set. Lights, backdrop, costumes, no structure behind it. And the man, who had spent 14 years looking at my son like he wasn't enough, had been drowning in debt the entire time he was doing it. Daniel called me on a Tuesday night. His voice had the hollowed quality of a man who has just walked through a door he can't walk back through, which I recognize because I've heard that voice before. I've used it myself, standing in the hospital the night Edna died. "Dad," he said, 14 years. He made me feel like every time I sat at that table, all of it. And the whole time he was. "I know, son. Why didn't you say something? You had to have known." "I had suspicions," I said. "But Daniel, a man doesn't tear down his son's marriage to prove a point, even when the point needs proving. That's not what fathers are for." He didn't say anything for a long moment. I could hear him breathing, working through something. "What do I do now, Dad?" And right there, that question, that raw and simple question, was the most groan I'd heard my son sound since he called me from the hospital parking lot after Sophie was born. "Nothing tonight," I said. "Get some sleep. I'll be here tomorrow." I had my own conversation to prepare for. I'd already spoken with Carol Briggs about restructuring. The $12,000 in the envelope in the kitchen drawer had a new destination, but I wasn't ready to move it yet. There was one thing I needed to do first. Stuart Pruitt called me on a Thursday morning. I was in the backyard, doing the thing I do when I need to think, which is pull weeds from the flower bed Edna planted along the back fence 20 years ago. I maintain it every spring. I can't explain why it helps. It just does. My phone buzzed. Brentwood area code. I picked up. Frank. Stuart's voice was different without a dinner table between us. Smaller, like a building you see from the highway that turns out to be a facade on a commercial lot, all front, nothing behind. He said he'd heard there was some confusion about the rehearsal dinner and some issue with Sophie's fund, and he wanted to clear the air man to man. He said he was also in a position to cover the matching amount he'd promised Daniel as soon as a pending deal closed. These things have timelines, Frank. You know how it is. I pulled a dandelion out by the root and set it in the pile. "Stuart," I said, "I'm going to stop you right there." He stopped. "I don't need an explanation. I'm not angry at you." "I want you to understand that clearly," I said. "I'm not angry. I'm finished. There's a meaningful difference between the two." Silence. "I've spent 14 years being courteous at your dinner table while you made my son feel like a man on probation in his own family. I never said a word because it wasn't my place. I wrote checks because I loved my son, and I wasn't about to let him go to you for help and give you that satisfaction. But I'm 68 years old, Stuart, and I'm retired. From electrical work and from pretending." Long pause. "Frank, let me finish. You told Daniel you were matching Sophie's college savings. You haven't. You've told your daughter her whole life that you came from strength. You didn't. You came from the appearance of strength, which is a completely different thing. My late wife Edna built a flower bed in our backyard from seed, not from a landscape company. She put her hands in the dirt and she made something live. That bed is still there 20 years later." I looked at the marigolds coming up along the fence. "That's what lasts, Stuart. Not the circular driveway. The thing you actually put your hands on." Another long silence. When he spoke again, the performance was gone. What was left was just a man, tired and exposed. And honestly, I almost felt something for him. Almost. I should have been better to Daniel, he said quietly. Yes, I said, you should have. Now let him stand up straight. That's all I'm asking. He hung up. I set the phone on the garden wall and pulled weeds for another 20 minutes. Now, friends, here is where I tell you what happened to the $12,000. 3 weeks before the wedding, Sophie Deller, 19 years old, first year at MTSU, studying environmental science, the girl I taught to ride a bike in this very driveway, came to see me, not sent by Daniel, not coached by Melissa. She drove over herself on a Wednesday afternoon, knocked on my door, and stood on my porch with her mother's eyes and her father's jawline, and asked if she could come in. She sat at Edna's kitchen table and told me she'd been talking to her dad, that she knew about the money, all of it, that she'd gone back and looked at her own baby photos and noticed how many of them were taken in this house, at this table, and how in every single one her grandfather was there. "Grandpa," she said, "Dad said you froze my college fund." She looked at me steady. "Did you freeze it because of Grandma and Grandpa Pruitt?" I looked at my granddaughter for a long moment. "I froze it," I said, "because I needed everyone to understand what was and wasn't visible in our family, including me, including your dad. I needed us all to see the ledger clearly for once." She was quiet. Then she said, "I always saw it clearly," and I had to set down my coffee cup. She asked me what I was going to do with the money. I slid the envelope across the table. "It's yours," I said. "It was always yours. No conditions. No one else's name on it." I paused. "Your grandmother and I put money into that account the week you were born. The rest came later from the years in between. Every dollar was earned clean and saved on purpose, and it belongs to you. I just needed your parents and some other people to understand that it came from somewhere real." Sophie opened the envelope, looked at the account summary, looked at me. "Grandpa," her voice was very careful, the way people get when they're working to stay composed. "Grandma and Grandpa Pruitt said they were going to help with school." "I know what they said," I told her gently. "That's between them and you and your parents to sort out. All I can tell you is what I put in that account, and why." She stared at the documents for a moment. Then she folded them carefully, put them back in the envelope, and looked up at me with her grandmother's directness. "You know what Mom says about you?" "What does she say?" "She says you're the only person in the whole situation who never needed anything from anybody." Sophie paused. I think she meant it as a compliment. I think I laughed for the first time in about 3 weeks. I told her, "Your grandmother would have loved you so much, Sophie. Go eat something. You look like a college student." She laughed big and free, the way 19-year-olds laugh when the relief finally hits, and we ate leftover chicken and talked about her environmental science thesis for an hour and a half. And for that hour and a half, I forgot about every dinner party and every monogrammed shirt and every paper-cut smile for a while. I need to tell you what happened with Melissa, because it matters. She called me the Saturday before the wedding. She had clearly rehearsed the opening. I could hear the steadiness that costs something. But somewhere around the third sentence the rehearsal fell away, and it was just her voice, no armor. "Frank," she said, "I've wanted to say this for a long time, and I didn't have the language for it, but I'm going to try." She paused. "My father made me believe my whole life that what mattered was the image of a thing, not the thing itself. I didn't question it because I grew up inside it, but I spent 14 years watching you show up quietly, without announcement, without ever asking for credit, and the contrast was always there. I just didn't let myself look at it." She took a breath. "I should have looked at it sooner, and I should never have let that dinner invitation stand. I am sorry, Frank. A real apology, not a polite one." I was quiet for a moment. Edna used to say that the most honest thing a person can do is apologize without building themselves an escape route in the same sentence. Melissa's apology had no escape route. "I appreciate that, Melissa," I said, "and I want you to know that I never blamed you. Not for your father's choices, not for any of it." There was a long exhale on her end. "You should have," she said softly. "Maybe," I told her. But I didn't. The wedding was on the second Saturday in May, and it was beautiful. Small venue outside of Franklin, old barn converted to an event space, String lights in the rafters and wildflowers in mason jars on the tables because Melissa doesn't like arranged flowers, never has. Sophie was maid of honor, which technically made no sense given whose wedding it was, but she and Melissa had agreed years ago that she would stand up there, and they'd made it work. I was there for all of it. The rehearsal dinner situation, for the record, resolved itself the moment Melissa told her mother what she'd told me. The Pruitts did not attend the rehearsal dinner. I did. Daniel and I set up folding chairs in the barn together the afternoon before. Not talking much, just working. That particular silence, the silence of a father and son after the repair has been made, but before they've found the words for, it feels nothing like avoidance. It feels like relief. I sat in the front row during the ceremony, next to an empty chair, with Edna's photo propped against the back, which Daniel had put there without telling me. I did not hold it together when I saw that. I want to be honest about that. I am 68 years old, and I did not hold it together. Sophie walked Melissa down the aisle because Melissa's father couldn't be there without the conversation about the debt and the matching fund and the years of performance becoming the centerpiece of the day. That was Melissa's decision. It was the right one. Stuart Pruitt, I'm told, has been making arrangements. The Brentwood house is in the process of being sold. The SUV went back months ago. The country club membership was quietly canceled rather than suspended. He and Patricia have moved to a smaller place in a neighboring county where nobody knows the version of Stuart Pruitt he'd been performing for 20 years. I don't know what he does with himself now. I find I don't think about it very often. I think about the barn in Franklin, string lights in the rafters, Daniel dancing with Sophie to a song Edna would have loved, Melissa finding me between courses and squeezing my arm without saying anything, because nothing needed to be said. I think about what it feels like when you've been carrying something a long time, and then you're not carrying it anymore. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just light. The way a house feels after you pull the old wiring and run a clean line, nothing flickering, nothing straining, everything exactly as much as it needs to be, and not 1 volt more. Here's the thing nobody tells you about staying quiet for a long time, and then finally drawing a line, friends. It doesn't feel the way you think it will. It doesn't feel like victory or revenge. It feels like finishing a job you started a long time ago. It feels like looking at the work and knowing it's solid, and knowing you did it right, and knowing that 20 years from now, the people who matter will still be living inside it. I'm Frank Deller, 68 years old, retired electrician from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I wired houses for 35 years, and I never cut a corner once. Not on a circuit, not on a family. The flower bed, Edna planted, is coming up beautifully this spring. Sophie's coming for dinner next Sunday. Daniel said he'd come early and help me with the back porch railing that's been needing attention for 2 years now. We'll do it right. We always do. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments below, hit the like button, and make sure you're subscribed. There's more coming. I'll see you on the next one.